as a toxicologist, what are some of the most common sources of toxins in our daily lives that people might not be aware of?
Probably the biggest source is drinking water. I think a lot of people are unaware that tap water in general just is polluted all over the country. And to make things worse, people drink bottled water thinking it's better when it's actually not.
Wow. So what are the kinds of toxins to be found in typical tap water?
Well, you can find things like heavy metals, pesticides. You can find fluoride and other toxic substances that are the result of chlorination of water to disinfect. So disinfection byproducts, halogens, all sorts of different things, pharmaceutical drugs, hormones, industrial runoff. I mean, they try to filter as much of it out, and that's why the chlorination takes place, but that creates more toxic intermediates.
And what are toxic intermediates? What
Like
does
basically just like byproducts of the process of chlorination. So then you get these halogenated disinfection byproducts that can be even more toxic than whatever it was they were trying to disinfect in the first place.
Wow. And does this differ region to region? I mean, I grew up, for example, in New York City drinking exclusively tap water. And I just actually distinctly remember it tasting quite good. But here in LA, the tap water is disgusting. And I've never drank the tap water here. So I would assume that there's wide variation region to region.
Yeah, definitely. So it depends on where your source water is. But a lot of the water in the U.S., there's been studies showing over 40% are contaminated with PFAS chemicals as well. So that's another one that we need to be aware of. But it definitely is regionally specific. But for the most part, in general, tap water is not the type of water you want to be drinking exclusively anymore.
Now, are the levels of toxicants in the water levels that we ought to be concerned about? Is the concern more acute poisoning, or is it more chronic? We just don't know, what a certain chemical consumed over the long term, even in low doses, is doing to our health.
Well, it's actually both. So there are cases when there's extraordinary high levels of lead in drinking water, like Flint, Michigan. So there are contamination events that can cause acute toxicity. But in general, for most people who are not in those sort of emergent situations, then it's chronic. These low dose chronic exposures through drinking water, and a lot of people need to drink water, right? So you can't really avoid them unless you are removing them from your water.
And why are more people not talking about this if this is so ubiquitous, so common?
I think it's that there isn't much that's being done on the federal level or on the municipal level. So every municipality has their own filtration system. And so if you will check the water report for your local area, you can see what's being removed, but you can also see what remains, right? So it's just that I think the infrastructure needs to be improved. It's the chlorination and fluoridation of water that's really causing a lot of issues.
And alternatively, people will turn to bottled water. And you suggested that could be even worse?
It can be in some cases, because there's even, if you look on a bottle of water that says purified water, that's actually just filtered tap water. But you're not really improving the quality or the purity much more than the tap water already was. So you're not removing that much. So you still have a lot of pollutants and contaminants in there. And then the plastic bottle itself is releasing microplastics and endocrine disruptors and heavy metals into the water.
Yikes. Yeah, there was a report published by Consumer Reports that came out just a couple months ago that found that one brand of water, Poland Spring, had particularly high levels of a certain phthalate. Maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so it depends on the type of bottle that was used, but there's typically phthalates that are used to produce plastic. So in order to make plastic malleable and moldable and, to be able to be made into a bottle shape, there has to be plasticizer chemicals. And these, unfortunately, are typically phthalates and some bisphenols, depending on the type of plastic. But these chemicals are known to disrupt estrogen balance in the body.
I've heard, and correct me if I'm wrong, that bisphenols are used to harden plastic and phthalates are used to soften plastic. So if you have a soft plastic, like what you might find in a bottle of water, that those tend to be phthalates in terms of the plasticizing chemicals that you might be exposed to.
Right, that's correct.
Wow. So how do we rectify this situation? How do we reduce our exposure?
Well, first we need to invest in a water filter. I think at this point, we can't really avoid this aspect. people thinking that we don't need to filter it and then later finding out that their water quality has been horrible all this time. I think that's a really big issue. So at this point, there isn't much that we can do besides filter it. However, I have actually come across some recent studies showing that if you boil tap water, you can actually remove microplastics and nanoplastics. 80% reduction just by boiling the tap water.
Where does the plastic go? How does that work?
So it actually gets sucked down into the white crust that forms at the bottom. So it depends on the amount of calcium in your tap water, but most tap water should have enough calcium in it to cause that precipitation, and it'll pull the microplastics out. And then another study came out showing that if you add lemon juice to your water, it can actually prevent the formation of disinfection byproducts.
Whoa.
So boiling tap water is actually showing to be pretty helpful.
Well, what about charcoal filters? These are pretty common. Some people have them in their refrigerators. Some people have pitcher filters. Are those effective?
They're effective to a certain degree because we really need to look at what they're actually removing, right? So there's so many different things that can bind to charcoal, but some things won't. And it depends on size. It depends on the affinity of that chemical to the charcoal, right, in the filter. It's not a one size fits all. It won't remove everything. So even with the boiling, there haven't been studies showing that boiling can remove PFAS, for example, and that's a big problem in drinking water. So boiling, I think, is an option for people that don't have the money or access to get a proper filtration system, but still be aware that there's other stuff left behind. So hopefully there are some sort of home methods that are developed that can help people get rid of the PFAS in the water too.
What about reverse osmosis purifiers? I had one for a long time by AquaTrue, and I thought it worked phenomenally well. But then there was always the concern for me about remineralization, the fact that reverse osmosis purifiers remove everything from the water, including minerals that you would otherwise want to be there.
Right. So reverse osmosis removes the most amount of contaminants, but like you said, it can also remove the beneficial minerals. So in that case, you can remineralize your water, like you said. For some people, some people don't do that, but I think over time, we need the minerals in our water. So I think it's, in my opinion, this is what I do. I have a reverse osmosis and I add mineral drops to my water.
Currently, I buy spring water in glass. Is that advisable?
Yeah, I mean, just the glass in and of itself is helping you to avoid the plastic.
Yeah. Although the water does flow through a dispenser, but it's cold water. So I'm assuming, maybe I'm wrong in this assumption, but I'm assuming that I'm not exposing myself to plastic because heat tends to catalyze that leaching. Whereas the water is very, rapidly, temporarily flowing through those tubes. Yeah,
you bring up a really good point because the leaching increases with time of contact. It increases with temperature, low pH. So all of those are not necessarily factors in this type of dispenser. But I think leaving your water sitting in a plastic container, that's still problematic because of the contact duration, the time. So the longer it sits, the leaching can still happen.
Yeah, it's not sitting in any plastic container, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Talk to us about your background, because I'm fascinated by the field of toxicology. I've written about it as a journalist. I've written about many topics actually that would probably fall under that that umbrella. But how do you arrive at your profession?
I actually discovered toxicology by accident when I was in college looking for a summer job. So I actually became a dishwasher in a toxicology research lab and then started getting interested in what they were doing. And then I had the opportunity to become a research student as part of my undergraduate studies. So then I stayed in toxicology. I published a paper when I was an undergrad, which I was really proud of. And then I continued on and just stayed. I just wanted to keep going. It was either that or go into another profession, either medicine, health related. But I was really just hooked on basic research, toxicology, studying how chemicals interact with our cells. How can we protect ourselves? That's always been just at the core of everything that I'm interested in scientifically.
Wow. Were you shocked when you discovered how toxic our environment had become?
Yeah, I was actually pretty shocked because growing up, no one ever talked about this. In fact, toxicology is a very lesser known field. Small number of people. It's just not widely known. And that's one of the reasons why I'm speaking out about it, is because there is an entire sector of science, a field of science that is looking into toxic chemicals and how do we make sure that things are safe, and using data and evidence and studies. Like This is really important to inform our decisions because not everything is toxic. But we need to know, are there concerns? And if so, how do we mitigate them? How do we avoid them? But yes, I was very shocked because growing up, I did have health problems and I didn't understand why until I started incorporating the environmental component into my lifestyle is when I started to feel better.
Well, it's very concerning. As a guy, I mean, studies have come out recently showing, I mean, I guess these are small studies, but they found nonetheless that, for example, 100% of subjects tested had microplastics in their testicles. And
penis.
And penis.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty concerning. Like, I don't have a toxicology degree, but I mean, that just right there, I mean, that's a check engine light, to say the least.
Yeah, totally. Because I think this is something that has been building up and it's not being studied until now, even though plastics have been in our society for decades. It kind of underscores the entire landscape of how chemicals are released and developed in the world. And they're innocent until proven guilty, which is the opposite of how things should be and is the reason why we are seeing microplastics in all different tissues of the body. So it started off as lung, gut, blood, heart tissue. Now there's testicle, penis, and even infant meconium, which is the baby's first fecal movement, which means that babies are being exposed to microplastics in the womb. Did I say placenta? It's also in the placenta. So they're able to penetrate and transverse and cross cellular membranes. So through lung epithelium, through the gut epithelium, and also through the skin.
Why does it seem as though the burden of proof is on the consumers, on the patients? Like that to me doesn't make any sense. Why isn't the burden of proof on these companies to prove that their products are safe, these chemicals are safe, before unleashing them into the environment? Yeah,
it's really at the government level. The federal regulations, at least in the US, are not as stringent as they could be. In other places of the world, like Europe, they require a lot more data, evidence, safety testing upfront before you can sell a new product in Europe. If you want to introduce a new food ingredient or any type of cosmetic ingredient, you have to undergo some level of a safety check. There is an expert, a toxicologist like me, sitting in Europe that does this. In the US, the FDA says, well, the burden of proof is on the industry, but no one's ever checking on it. It's just, oh, well, you have to have the data, but it's okay. We're not going to ask you for it. So it's pointless.
Is it due to money? Is it that they're lobbyists? I mean, I have no idea.
Yeah, there's industry groups, a lot of lobbying that goes on. So I think the regulations are highly influenced by industry.
One interesting thing that I saw on your Instagram, which is phenomenal, by the way, such a great resource for people. You've said, as a toxicologist, you never burn candles in your home. Why not?
Candles, well, let me back up. Air quality and indoor air pollution are major determinants of health. The reason being that whenever you inhale something, it has a potential to quickly and easily enter your bloodstream and go directly to your brain. This means that it is extremely sensitive. It's not to be taken lightly. What you inhale will go into your body, into your brain. Okay, so just keep that at top of mind. When you light a candle, you're not just liberating fragrance chemicals, but there also is toluene, benzene, and other toxic chemicals that are known to be human carcinogens through the route of inhalation being released into the air. And it's people light candles. Historically, they were lighting maybe beeswax or tallow candles for providing light. We don't necessarily need candles anymore, but people use them for religious reasons. There's many reasons to use candles. But when you are using a conventional candle with synthetic dyes, petroleum-based wax, and synthetic undisclosed fragrance in particular, you're releasing particulate matter, ultrafine particulate matter, which is the most hazardous type. So we really need to be careful, especially if you have kids. These chemicals are not just staying in the air, they attach to house dust and deposit on the surfaces of your home. So if you have a baby that's crawling around on the floor, putting things in his or her mouth, their airways are close to the ground, they're inhaling all of this and ingesting all of these particles. And pound for pound, they cannot detoxify the way that adults can. Their bodies are developing, and these early life exposures have lifelong consequences.
I mean, the link between exposure to fine particulate matter and conditions like cardiovascular disease, Alzheimer's disease, I believe is well elucidated at this point, but you're saying ultrafine particulate matter is being released by these products, candles.
Yes, that's correct.
And others. So I can't even, imagine what how easily that's able to permeate our bodies.
Right. Magnitudes, orders of magnitude. And just the fact that they're so small, they can just pass the alveoli in the deepest parts of the lung is 1 cell thick. It just passes right through, goes into the bloodstream. And what these are doing are causing oxidative stress. So once you get, it's free radical damage. So once you get one oxidative molecule, it's going to pass that free electron from one molecule to the next. It can damage DNA. That's oxidative DNA damage. That's a basis for cancer. Then you can get lipid peroxidation. That's a basis for inflammation. So many other diseases can be explained just simply by looking at the process of oxidation that's happening in our bodies and free radical damage from so many sources.
Wow. And you're a mom of two?
Two girls.
Yeah, 2 girls. So what would you say are the core tenets of living a quote-unquote low-tox lifestyle?
Well, first and foremost, low-tox living means to do your best to avoid as many toxicants as you can, 80% of the time. 80-20 lifestyle. And I'm sure you heard a lot of people say this, but it actually makes sense in the context of low-tox because not everything's toxic. You can't control everything anyway. So just do the best that you can, and especially focus on cleaning up the things that everyone needs. So I like to look at it as a low tox pyramid, kind of like the food pyramid, but not the messed up one. The basic needs that everyone has are clean air, clean water, and clean food. Those are the basics. And then the next layer above that would be clean, products that you're applying to your skin and using around your home. Those types of consumables like beauty and personal care, household cleaning products, laundry care, those types of things. And then above that would be things like clothing, textiles, right? Mattresses, pillows, that kind of stuff. Everything in your home that you can control. And then at the top would be those kind of wellness tools like a sauna or a cold plunge. You don't need them. You can get the benefits by doing other free things. But I like to think of it like that because a low tox life aims to not be overwhelming. Just take one step at a time. And if you think of it like, hey, what are the basics? Do I have clean water? Have I removed all the sources of indoor air pollution as I can? Am I doing my best to clean my home regularly? If you're doing those things already, you're already in good shape. Because I think people want to jump and skip steps and then they get overwhelmed and they say, oh my gosh, everything needs to go. I need to change everything out. It's overwhelming. It's expensive. I can't do it. And then they give up.
They get overwhelmed.
Right. So I think the key to not getting overwhelmed is to just do it one step at a time.
One step at a time. One thing that I really appreciate about your work is that you're also a critic of what is referred to as greenwashing. So how do consumers better identify what's simply marketing and greenwashing, so to speak, versus a product that is actually clean and free of these kinds of worrying toxins?
Greenwashing is basically the use of unsubstantiated claims to make consumers feel like a product is safer, more environmentally friendly, or healthier than it actually is. So this is all just a marketing ploy. And greenwashing happens on the front of the bottle, the front of the package. Everything in the front, I always tell people, ignore that. Flip it over if you're buying packaged goods, if you're buying any packaged foods, any personal care, beauty products, household cleaning products, anything that has an ingredients list. Look at those instead. Don't look at the colors because they'll use green colors to make you think of plants, nature, therefore it's healthy. So they'll use words like natural, which is completely not defined at all federally. So most terms, for example, milk has a federal definition of what milk is. But the word natural is not federally defined or regulated. So companies can use it however they want. They can say things are non-toxic. Well, how can you prove that? The only way to really know what you're buying is to read the ingredients list.
And how can people, what are some ways to better understand? I mean, because, very few of us have the kind of training that you have. Any tools, tips in terms of assessing an ingredients list?
Yeah, so if you look at an ingredients list, just know that the first few ingredients are the most abundant. So that's what the product is made of mostly. If it's water and it's got a bunch of other stuff in it, just know that water, you're basically buying expensive water. for a lot of products. And in particular, I mean skincare products and beauty products. But in general, if you look at an ingredients list, what you want to see are easily recognizable ingredients. Ingredients that you don't have to Google or research to understand what they are. For example, if you're buying a shampoo that has 10 really scary sounding chemical names, that might not be the best option for you. That's not always the case, because there are some synthetic chemicals that are not hazardous. But if you can see something like aloe vera juice, some sort of plant extract, soap bark, or something like that, something that you can recognize as a plant or as a food, beef tallow, that's a great, skincare ingredient. You can recognize that.
Beef tallow, interesting.
Yeah, it's becoming really popular these days. I see a lot of brands coming out with beef tallow, body butters, lotions, all different kinds of things. Sunscreen.
Wow. Do you use beef tallow on your skin?
I do.
Wow. As like a moisturizer?
Yeah. So cool. They have body butters that, and it doesn't smell like beef. That was my concern. They put essential oils in it to provide some kind of scent, but also benefit to the skin. And it works pretty well.
Wow. That's good to know. A lot of people, you hear this, adage to only put on your skin something that you might be able to consume. Is that something that you think is a decent heuristic to abide by?
I think if you are not wanting to look any further beyond, let me back up. I don't think it's a bad way of thinking, but it's very limiting. It's very restricting. Because there are certain foods that you shouldn't put on your skin. For example, chili peppers. That's a food, but the capsaicin might burn your eyes. It's not a good idea. And I think it's important to know that not all synthetic chemicals are bad. That's the thing, is that people want to be quote unquote chemical free, but that doesn't make any sense, because literally everything is made out of a chemical. So what I aim to do is to help people understand which are the healthier ingredients that you can look for instead of the conventional ones. So calling out the conventional red flag ingredients and then, hey, look for this one instead. Or, hey, this is a better product based on the ingredients. So that's what I'm trying to educate people on, is how to actually do that for themselves. Because ingredients are changing all the time. They don't stay the same. Manufacturers can swap things out left and right. They don't have to tell you. And if you're not reading the ingredients list, you're not paying attention, and then suddenly one day you break out in a rash.
Why do you think? Why does there seem to be so many credentialed antagonists on social media to the so-called low tox lifestyle? I mean, as a consumer, sometimes you will express concern about a certain chemical, and then you get, it's almost like a lynch mob comes after you, like, well, what is the toxin? At what dose? In what context? Show me the evidence. And I'm like, it's just, to me, it just seems like another form of gaslighting, because consumers are sick. Consumers, public health statistics are really staggeringly, on a downward slope. And I don't think it's all about calories, as some might suggest. I think we are really being exposed, to innumerable chemical toxicants on a daily basis. But it seems like swimming upstream advocating for this sometimes, particularly on social media.
You're absolutely right. And in fact, I would say I might even be a black sheep amongst the toxicology community, because one of the key things that you mentioned was the dose. The dose isn't always the only thing that determines if something is causing harm. Endocrine disrupting chemicals are everywhere. The phthalates that we've been talking about, the fragrance chemicals, these are causing harm at extremely low levels. Dose responses and the dose makes the poison concept was coined by Paracelsus hundreds of years ago. And he was a genius. Okay, he was a visionary, but times have changed. New chemicals have been introduced. We can't just always rely on the old stuff and just say, like, this is the way things are. We have to be flexible and be open to what the evidence is showing. And unfortunately, the evidence that I speak of is the rates of human disease. And when people say, show me the evidence, well, guess what? There is no evidence, because it was never tested. If it was tested, I would be happy to show you. The evidence is when you remove that substance, suddenly you might feel better. That's the evidence that I'm looking for. I don't care if it was shown to be safe on a rat. If it doesn't make me feel good, I don't care. If I remove it and I feel better, that's what matters the most.
Yeah. I want to read a line from a Consumer Reports article that came out over the past year. Many of these thresholds set by our regulatory bodies do not reflect the most current scientific knowledge and may not protect against all potential health effects of these chemicals. The decision to allow them in food is not evidence-based.
I would agree with that. And also agree across all consumer products. So the levels that are set are based on animal studies at extraordinarily high doses for short periods of time. What is most relevant to humans is chronic exposure. And oftentimes the data that are used to create these sort of quote unquote safe levels are not chronic data. You can't compare apples to oranges.
Yeah.
It doesn't make any sense, but it's too expensive to run 2-year chronic toxicity studies. It's millions of dollars for one compound, let alone all the chemicals in a product, because products are not just made of a single chemical. They're made of a multitude of chemicals, but none of them have been tested in that mixture. So nobody knows if there's interactions that are happening and how those are impacting our health. It's completely one-sided, it's narrow-sided, it's missing the mark entirely.
My understanding of how it works, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that they'll take a certain compound and they'll give it to an animal, and they'll continue to titrate up the dose until they arrive at the no observed adverse effects level. And then we assume, based on that level, that anything below that level is essentially safe. And then they extrapolate that, obviously, to humans. And that's generally how many of these thresholds are set. But with many of these endocrine disrupting compounds, there's not a linear dose response. It's not necessarily the dose makes the poison. There's the concept in toxicology of non-monotonicity, where you might have low dose effects for various reasons. So yeah, if you could speak to that. Is that generally an accurate, I mean, obviously very simplified, but gist of how these regulatory thresholds are set?
That's a great explanation what you did. So basically when they administer doses to animals, they try to spread it out and get as many doses as they can. There's usually about 5, right? So then they'll say, well, the highest dose, we definitely expect to see an effect. And then you start to look downwards and see, okay, at which dose below that are there not effects, right? So it's usually between doses. You don't know the exact dose, right? Because you can only test so many. But you're right, it's based on that. So they say, well, below this dose, there shouldn't be an effect. And generally speaking, what happened when I was working in the chemical industry was you take that no observed adverse effect level, or NOEL, and you divide it by 100. You give it a 100-fold margin of safety. So you say 100 times less than this, there should be no effect. That's the presumed calculation. But we know that's not always the case because rats are not people. And so plenty of cases when drugs and other chemicals are tested on rats and then, oh, it's fine, but then, oops, it's causing all of these people to die. So maybe it's not the best. And so I think animal testing, although in some regards it might be necessary, I think a lot of it is just confusing things and giving us a false sense of security, basically.
Yeah, and what you've said and what you've alluded to is that these tests don't account for the cumulative effect, the chronic effect, or the effect of these chemicals in the context of other chemicals, which is pretty scary.
Exactly, because we're not just exposed to one chemical at a time. It doesn't make sense to do this, but it's not just one product that we're using that has a lot of stuff in it. It's multiple products. I mean, we're surrounded by, things, and they're all made up of compounds. So you can't just negate it and say, well, we did these tests and it looks clean, therefore it shouldn't cause disease or harm in any other context. It's kind of a blanket statement. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's completely nonsense in my opinion, but that's what we have to go off of, because technically you're not allowed to run human studies where you subject people to increasing doses of different things. That's technically not ethical. But unfortunately, the society we live in, the way that things are done, consumers are the test subjects. We're unwilling test subjects in an experiment, unfortunately.
Yeah, this dawned on me a couple years ago when I saw a study that found that sunscreens, chemical sunscreens, chemical sunscreens might pose their own risks, right? The oxybenzones or the avobenzones I know have been highlighted as potential endocrine disruptors. But this study found for the first time that these chemicals are not inert. They, when exposed to sun, when exposed to chlorine in pools, they transform into completely different chemicals that pose their own set of risks that are, understudied. Huge knowledge gap for us. What are they doing to our children? These novel chemicals that these compounds convert to. I mean, we assume that chemicals, we spread them on our bodies, they're inert, hopefully they're safe, but we seldom consider how these chemicals are interacting with, these other exposures, whether it's UV rays from the sun, chlorine in our pools.
Right.
Crazy.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, because it's like, okay, well, if I inject it into a rat, well, first of all, it's supposed to go on your skin. So if you're injecting it, how is that relevant? Secondly, like you said, photoactivation by the sun, that's a huge problem. There's heat, there's so many different elements. Nobody knows how these chemicals are reacting. They just see it in the vacuum of, oh, well, we spray it on the skin, it should be fine. Again, it's the issue that we're facing is the synthetic chemicals. It's not the historically used chemicals or compounds that our ancestors used, because what's missing is the context of a history of safe human use. When you have that history, then we know we are the ultimate test subject. If our ancestors were using it with very little to no harm, then that's pretty clear indication that it's probably not an issue. But it's also scale. The amount that's being released into the environment, the amount that's flooding the marketplace, that's also at the core of the problem.
What kind of sunscreen do you use for yourself and your kids?
I actually use zinc oxide based. I have some that are made out of tallow. That's interesting. That's a really interesting one. But other ones that are just made out of organic ingredients that you can find, I think at Sprouts or any health food store, you can find these kind of sunscreen products. But I would look for non-nano zinc oxide.
Non-nano zinc oxide.
And non-aerosol. This is very important. I know the aerosol sunscreens are very convenient, but the problem is that when you apply them, if you've ever seen anyone spraying sunscreen on their body, most of it's going into the air. It's not landing on their skin. It's not evenly distributed. So are you even getting adequate protection? You end up spraying a whole lot. It poses an inhalation risk. And years ago, not that long ago, thousands of aerosol products were recalled because of benzene contamination. Benzene is a human carcinogen via the route of inhalation. And why it was in these products, likely because of the petroleum-based propellants that were used.
Benzene is in cigarette smoke.
Yes, and also candles, conventional candles.
Wow.
So we don't need to be inhaling benzene. If you can avoid it, that's best. I think that's best. With aerosol sunscreen, even if it's mineral-based, we don't need to inhale zinc oxide. We can spread it on our skin in a cream-based formula. That's absolutely fine.
Okay, gotta dip into the world of organic versus conventional. This is a very controversial topic on social media, although I don't think it should be. Organic versus not organic. Is it worth it? Is organic worth it?
In my opinion, yes. Because low-level exposures to pesticides, let's say prenatally, have been shown to have neurotoxic effects in children. So there's neurobehavioral effects, cognitive defects in kids whose parents consume foods that were pesticide treated, versus organic foods prohibit certain types of pesticides, and therefore just the burden already on the consumer is less. And not only that, but on the environment, what's getting washed down into the water system, into the soil, and also for the occupational workers that don't have to spray these toxic chemicals on food and wear hazmat suits.
Yeah, occupational exposure to herbicides and pesticides is it's crazy, the connection now being made between certain herbicides like paraquat and rotenone and Parkinsonism. These are human health outcomes that are understudied in the setting of these herbicides and pesticides. A lot of the emphasis is placed on cancer, but there's a whole host of other conditions that might be triggered by chronic exposure occupationally to these herbicides and pesticides. But Critics will say, well, organic, when you consume organic is not a guarantee that you're not being exposed to pesticides. There are still certain pesticides that are organic approved. Organic is not more nutritious than conventional. How do you respond to those critics?
Well, I just look at the evidence, look at the data. Just look at what the regulations are supposed to do for us. Just look at what is in the National Organic Program. What's outlined, what's not allowed are synthetic fertilizers, synthetic chemicals, and GMOs, right? And I think that people can argue whatever they want. At the end of the day, eating a diet of whole, unprocessed foods, even if it's conventional, by far trumps anything that's processed. Even if it's organic, even if the ingredients are immaculate, it doesn't matter. The process of manufacturing processed foods introduces toxins, period, end of story. No argument there. But when it comes to organic versus conventional whole foods, if you can afford it, organic is the way to go. Not just, like I mentioned, on the consumer, but also on the environment and on the occupational exposure. And there's even evidence that people who live near agricultural areas have higher incidence of things like respiratory disorders, neurotoxic problems. So there are conditions that are associated with just being in proximity, not even consuming them.
It's scary. If money is tight, for example, I mean, we live in chaotic times. A couple weeks ago, I mean, there were whispers of a possible recession on the horizon, although I think that's all but dissipated at this point. What do you prioritize in terms of what you're purchasing organic if money is an issue?
It would be, I actually shop using the Environmental Working Group's Clean 15 and Dirty Dozen lists. So these are lists of produce products that were tested by the U.S. Department of Agriculture and other sources of data. And they compiled it basically showing which are the produce products that are most likely to be sprayed. Those would be considered the Dirty Dozen. And then the Clean 15 are ones that you can be more confident about buying conventional. And I think that's extremely helpful because if you're not out there, talking to every single farmer to know their practices, a lot of people don't have time to do that or the access. So I think it's a really great resource to be able to know, well, for example, strawberries, they're always going to be on the dirty list. I remember learning this as a student in toxicology. Strawberries are one of the most heavily sprayed crops, especially if you're buying them out of season. They're being artificially ripened. I wouldn't touch those. So also eating in season is helpful locally. And if you can talk to the farmers, great. If you can't, then check out the EWG lists. They're very helpful. And you can also soak your produce at home.
Yeah, I definitely abide by that list, and I'm a fan of the Environmental Working Group. I've cited them many times. I got to speak recently at a conference in DC, the Brain and Environment Symposium, and I got to meet the president of the EWG, and I got to speak on the panel that I was on was a journalist who works with the Environmental Working Group. But I do see on social media claims of the Environmental Working Group, critics of even the Environmental Working Group, that the Environmental Working Group is a front for the organic industry, that it's not a scientific organization. I mean, how is your average consumer to make sense of all of this noise? We hear such divergent opinions so frequently. And so I love that you're the black sheep in the industry, but you're somebody who I get the sense is coming from a place of honesty. And so how is one to make sense of those criticisms?
I think it's important to sort of look at you can always follow the money and see where the noise comes from. And the noise, more often than not, in my experience, comes from industry. However, closely associated, I don't know, but there seems to be heavy ties to the industry, whether it be the food industry, the personal care product, the beauty industry, the chemical industry, just across the board. These industry groups have a lot of money behind them. And so it's not surprising that you hear a lot of pushback because, I mean, what is the problem with encouraging people to be healthier, right? I think that's just the biggest question in the room.
And to practice the precautionary principle, which is a concept that was first devised in the setting of environmentalism. But I actually think it's so apropos for as a lens through which to view food and the chemicals that we're allowing into our homes. because we've seen throughout history, I mean, this is just my own personal take on it, but we've seen so many times where the industry was like, no, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. Only decades later, after countless exposures, you know, to the human population, we've realized, oops, actually, that was toxic shit this whole time, you know? Like, as was the case with partially hydrogenated fats, trans fats, artificially created trans fats, lead in paint, asbestos in building supplies, talc in baby powder. So many instances where certain compounds were, you know, deemed safe for many, many, many years, only later to be found, you know, was doing real harm. And who's gonna have your back if you get sick one day from exposure to one of these chemicals? They're not, you know, nobody's coming to save you. There's no check, you know, waiting for you. Good luck trying to, you know, to form a class action suit, you know, if you, or even to be able to determine what specific exposure caused your illness. And so for me, I think the precautionary principle makes a ton of sense, but it just, you know, I guess common sense is lacking these days.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because common sense is what can really help you navigate when you're looking at all of these posts online. Are the ones that make you feel fearful, are they helping you or are they not? And oftentimes people, I think, on my end of the spectrum get accused of being fear mongers, but that isn't even the whole point of it. The point is to help you not have fear, to provide you with the tools and the resources and solutions to circumvent the fear, to push through the fear, and to just understand, like, hey, things aren't as clean as we once thought they were. Practice the precautionary principle, avoid them before, you know, something happens. Not that something will happen, but just to prevent, and just preventive care, just taking preventive measures. I don't think it makes sense to demonize wanting to be healthier. And I think that's what we see a lot of times online.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like eating a healthful diet and exercising regularly, for example, we know is a fantastic preventative strategy against type 2 diabetes and obesity, right? You might work out and eat a healthful diet, and conversely, you might be completely sedentary, but might have a genetic makeup where you might never have developed type 2 diabetes or obesity, for example. But that doesn't mean that those efforts were ever in vain. I mean, there's so many other benefits to eating a healthful, minimally processed diet and exercising regularly. Yeah, they're preventative against all these non-communicable conditions that you may or may not ever develop, but that doesn't mean that doing that wasn't a good idea all along.
Exactly. In my opinion, if you even attempt to avoid these toxic chemicals, it's only going to benefit you. There's no downside of it at all, in my opinion, health-wise.
Yeah.
It might require that you do some work, maybe invest and save money for some things that you might not have, like a water filter, things like that. If you don't, it's not the end of the world. Just do your best. There's so many free ways to avoid toxic chemicals. In fact, when you start cutting back and buying fewer products, you save money and you reduce your toxic load. It's pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. Okay, here's a confusing topic. Natural flavors. I consume products with natural flavors in them. But I understand that some people have concerns about these chemicals. What's your view?
My view is flavors are overused. Am I afraid of them? No. Do I know what's in them? I did for many years, yes. Had access to flavor formulations when I worked in the flavor industry. I evaluated thousands of chemicals for safety that were used in the flavors. There were a few restricted compounds, but those are actually naturally occurring in many cases in different plants and extracts and what have you. Not everything in flavors is awful, but are they always needed is the question. So for example, I was at the store and I saw salami that had natural flavor, and I thought, that seems just completely unnecessary. I'm not going to buy that. If it's something that doesn't need a flavor, it shouldn't have a flavor in it, that's a pretty good sign. Like, maybe avoid that product if it does. Or almond milk. Almond milk doesn't need a flavor, you know? So I think oftentimes our senses and our taste buds are somewhat being manipulated by these flavors because they are created to be more delicious than what you would find in nature.
Yeah, hyper palatable.
Exactly.
Typically with the intent of getting you to overconsume whatever the product is.
Right. I mean, if you ask any flavors, at least those that I had contact with, they'll say, yes, I would absolutely love to design a flavor that makes consumers just eat it nonstop because they love it so much. But it's not necessarily from a malicious standpoint. It's more of that's their art, that's their craft. They believe that making foods taste delicious is the way to go. And oftentimes these large scale manufacturers add flavors to make things consistent. Because as soon as the consumer senses that something has changed, they won't buy. Then you've lost a customer. So they start adding flavors to things just to make it have a baseline. So it's not always just coming from a bad place. I don't think flavors should be demonized. Should they be more transparent? Absolutely. The problem that people have is that they don't know what's going on behind the word flavor. They don't know what it means. And that's the problem. Of all the flavors that I worked on, I don't have concerns. Do I want to consume foods that have flavors all the time? No, because I want to taste real food.
It's similar to when you see fragrance on a label, right? Like that term fragrance can represent hundreds of chemicals, and there's very little transparency there.
Oh, absolutely. So the fragrance industry, the International Fragrance Association, or IFRA, they published their transparency list. So all the list of probably close to 4,000 chemicals right now that could potentially be put into a fragrance. And who knows how many of those 4,000 are in a fragrance, right? Fragrance or parfum. That's how it shows up on the label. When you look at the transparency list, it's fake transparency because you still don't know what's in that fragrance that you're buying. But it could be anything out of this list. It's like a mixed bag, right? And the problem is that they have known carcinogens, known endocrine disruptors in this transparency list. So they're telling us we're putting these in there. And there's even tests showing that 100% of 40 some odd fragrances, designer fragrances tested from a department store, tested positive for high levels of phthalates. Even those that were manufactured in Europe, where phthalates are not allowed.
Is cologne and like perfume for women, are those like the worst things ever?
Yes. I used to have perfumes and fragrances had a stronghold on me. And I think it's not surprising because our sense of smell is hardwired into our brain. And it elicits emotions and memories and triggers lots of different things. And so it's a sensory experience, and we're sensory beings. So I don't think it's a surprise that people are really connected and addicted to perfume. It's just the chemicals that are in there are not safe. We shouldn't be dousing ourselves in cologne and perfume and then wondering later on why you're experiencing fertility issues or migraines.
I mean, a lot of these compounds are xenoestrogens, right? They're like estrogenic.
Right.
So men are slathering themselves with colognes that are actually maybe in some capacity having a feminizing effect.
Yes. And men somehow think, oh, well, I'm a man. Testosterone is my hormone, right? Estrogen doesn't matter, but it does. It absolutely matters for men. And there are case studies of men that have higher levels of phthalates, that have lower semen quality, lower testosterone, and the parameters of fertility.
Wow. I haven't worn cologne in years, decades.
Good for you.
Probably. Yeah. Man, so crazy. Yeah, we live in such a skewed world where, I mean, you're almost like slapped on the wrist for discussing these topics now because there's so much money involved. But it's really sad. I mean, it's really sad. And I'm not often prone to pessimism, but I don't see things getting any better. Do you? With increased awareness, do you see this, do you see things improving, or is it just like getting worse and worse?
No, I absolutely see things improving.
You do?
Yes. I have been actively speaking out on this issue of toxic chemicals in consumer goods for a number of years. And in that span of time, when I started, the products that were available that were low tox, safer, better for us, were very few and far between, especially in stores. The big box stores carry the big brand names of the big top 8 corporations that basically run everything. They give you this illusion of choice, but most products are owned by these top corporations. And unfortunately, those are all the ones that have the ingredients of concern because they're cheap, they're easy to manufacture. Nobody's questioning it, so why change? We're making a ton of profit, so let's keep going. The smaller brands that are trying to make the healthier products, they have to compete with all these big brands to try and get shelf space. But with consumer pressure and demand, there has been a dramatic shift. When you walk into big box stores, now there is even a small section of healthier, more plant-based, quote unquote natural, I use that very lightly, products that are better for you. And it's amazing to see, to be honest. I'm amazed in such a short amount of time how much being loud about this topic and getting consumers to rally behind this has dramatically shifted things. And there are more small brands that are emerging that are making healthier products that really have people and planet as a priority instead of the profit. And those are the brands that we should be pushing to the forefront to try and drown out and let these other big brands know, hey, we're not standing for this. You've been putting parabens and phthalates and formaldehyde releasers in my shampoo for years. And now I, have this health problem. I'm not okay with this anymore.
Yeah, it's really important to vote with your wallet.
Oh, absolutely. That's how you hit them. And I think a lot of companies would be open to knowing if you decide not to buy a product, why is that? I think it does make a big impact. And I do it all the time. Like, hey, I used to buy your product. I don't like it anymore. Get rid of this ingredient and I might come back. Get rid of this ingredient. Get rid of that. I might come back. Or give them suggestions. If you, I really like your product, but the plastic packaging really has got to go. If you can change that, that would be great. And the more often they hear this, they will take heed because they don't want to run out. They don't want to lose out on business. They want to continue providing these healthier products.
Well, we need more people like you. I mean, not everybody has your pedigree and your background, your credentials. And I think oftentimes as a consumer, you get a lot of flack, especially today on social media. You're called a fearmongerer, people with all kinds of covert biases, vested interest will come after you. And it can be really overwhelming, intimidating, in fact. And I've seen this personally. I mean, there are certain topics that I'm like, oh, do I really want to, go down that, open that can of worms, for example, when talking about organic. But I mean, there are certain products that I preferentially buy organic, for example, dark leafy greens, berries, and things like that. But yeah, there's a lot of resistance to challenging the status quo today, unfortunately. It's a huge problem. How can consumers help? I mean, aside from voting with their dollars, is just continuing to beat the drum about this topic? Yeah,
just keep talking about it, keep sharing this information, spreading it with other people, but also be aware that there is a ton of misinformation online. So looking for the sources of reliable, evidence-based information is key. And I think that's oftentimes what happens is if I end up searching for a chemical or an ingredient online, if you type it into a search engine, you'll get a lot of, paid pages that show up. So it isn't necessarily unbiased. So you have to know where to look, how to look for it. And it's not necessarily obvious for everyone, but that's what I aim to do, is to share this knowledge with people so that they can go out and research for themselves and become more empowered and informed. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's not about controlling everything, running and hiding and being afraid of everything in the world. The state of the world is what it is. Can we avoid a lot of things? Yes. Can we help our body to detoxify and remove these chemicals? Yes, we can. It doesn't have to be difficult and it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I think just taking a moment, taking a pause to just make a more informed choice is already better than not.
Yeah. Do you have a stance on, because there's a big topic today on social media, industrially refined seed oils from a nutrition, from a health standpoint?
Well, just from a basic science standpoint, I see them as problematic, being that if they're processed with hexane, different solvents, these are not chemicals that we should be consuming regularly. Not to mention, if a fatty acid is easily oxidizable, we talked about this earlier, the process of oxidation and lipid peroxidation in the body, these give rise to free radicals. So when something is easily oxidizable, you are increasing the rate of oxidation in the body, which is the basis of aging and disease. Am I saying that seed oils are the only thing that are causing this? Absolutely not. Most chemicals out there, mechanistically, are destroying our proteins, our cells, and our lipid bilayers through the process of oxidation. Microplastics, all different types of chemicals that cause toxicity, cause harm in the body, chemicals that are found in cigarettes, in automobile exhaust, in smoke, heavy metals, they have a basic mechanism of causing oxidative stress.
And that mechanism has been elucidated for highly refined, oxidation-prone polyunsaturated fats when extracted from the food matrix, heated as they typically are, particularly in the restaurant setting, but they're marketed as cooking oils, so they're being exposed to heat. But I really welcome nuance being brought to the conversation because, you know, people love to identify or to believe that they've identified the boogeyman. And so a lot of people point at seed oils today as, you know, the soul smoking gun in terms of all of our health ailments. But I think, you know, it's important to recognize that there is no soul smoking gun. You know, this is a multifaceted issue. And I think with seed oils, it probably is a case of the dose making the poison. But, you know, you so much as bring up the topic today on social media, and it's become so inflamed, you know, and so polarized as so many other topics have become, where it's like, you know, on the one hand, some argue that they're the worst thing ever. Again, the sole boogeyman, the sole causal player in all of our problems. But then others seem to give them free rein and, you know, suggest that they're in fact healthy and we should be consuming more of them. Which at this juncture, I believe the truth is likely somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that because I think, well, it's not just one thing that's causing all of the health issues. It's the multitude, like you said, of all the things that we're being exposed to. If they're all triggering the same molecular mechanism and pathways, that kind of tells you something. It's not just one thing. It's the same core basic mechanism that's causing a lot of the issues that we're having.
Yeah.
Health-wise.
Well, the advocates for seed oils will say that, like, yeah, there's a lot of really scary mechanistic stuff and animal studies that show really kind of scary, you know, there's some scary potentiality there, but the human randomized control trials don't bear out the harms. The epidemiology don't necessarily show a signal of harm. But I don't know. I just think that the human randomized control trials are all very short term. The epidemiology is mired by lots of potential confounding. You know, polyunsaturated fats, for example, are found in very healthy foods like nuts and seeds and things like that, fish. So, for example, looking for serum levels of linoleic acid might actually indicate, and you know, seeing an association between higher levels and more positive health outcomes there might be healthy user bias there, you know. And also, these oils have been marketed as healthy for so many decades. So again, I mean, I have to default to the precautionary principle. I mean, these oils didn't exist in the human food supply prior to 70 years ago.
Yeah, that's how I practice as well. Just looking back on the historical data, what have we been safely using the longest? I'll stick to those. That's generally how I operate, and how I think that's an easy way of thinking about things. Just how have things historically been used? Yeah. Going back to what our ancestors did is a good idea, in my opinion, in many ways.
I think it's a great idea. What role would you say diet plays, or other lifestyle habits, interventions like sauna? You kind of alluded to sauna use earlier. Like in so far as our capacity to detoxify. I mean, what is one, you know, we've talked about a lot of scary things, obviously, over the course of this conversation, but as a consumer, as a you know, as somebody tasked with thriving or surviving and ultimately hoping to thrive in this environment, what are some ways to potentially, I don't know, detoxify? We've already talked about ways of reducing exposure, but any ways of, you know, of stacking the odds in our favor, you know, so as to be more resilient, because these exposures are to some degree inevitable today. I hate to say that, but it is true. So yeah, detoxifying, you know, it's sort of a word that's been co-opted in many ways by the wellness industry. But is there any way for us to detoxify in a way that's effective?
Yeah. So I love that you mentioned two things. First, you mentioned the fact that we should avoid, right? So I think in the process of detoxifying our lives, avoidance is absolutely imperative, because if you keep feeding your body more toxic substances, it can only detoxify to a certain rate. So removing the sources, removing the triggers, that's huge. The inputs, if you can cut them off, that's best. Number two, you can use lifestyle interventions. I am not a proponent of gimmicky detox pills, teas. That necessarily isn't going to be the best. What's best is lifestyle changes. So for example, if you take off your shoes at the door, you're leaving a lot of junk from outside. If you want to change into indoor shoes, that's great. Barefoot, whatever your preference is. Just leave the outside shoes at the door. Detoxify your air by simply opening a window. Opening a window can refresh the room air of an average size room in less than an hour. Completely. Just if you open a window. It doesn't even have to be completely wide open. And even during the winter, I know that it's colder, cooler, people may not want to do that. But actually, when I visit relatives in Germany, even in the dead of winter, as soon as you wake up in the morning, you have to open those windows and let the stale air out. You've got to let the fresh air in, even if it's cold. It's actually really invigorating, which I'm sure you've experienced as well. So simple things like that. Then you can also exercise. Exercise is massive for so many things. I mean, you've talked about it. Exercise, it's a non-negotiable. Moving your body can actually increase the amount of glutathione that you have in your body, which is the master antioxidant and detoxification molecule in the body. It's the most powerful. It's the most miraculous and amazing thing. And I'm a bit partial to it because I studied glutathione for my PhD.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yes, I absolutely studied glutathione in the context of how it can help protect our reproductive organs from toxic injury from environmental chemicals. And it does. So don't deplete your glutathione because once you do, it's really hard to bring it back without, adding in exogenous glutathione, for example.
So how do we upregulate our glutathione production?
So the sleeping is one. Exercising is another. Weight bearing and aerobic training both can increase glutathione. If you eat sources of sulfur in your diet, may or may not want to eat eggs. I put this on my Instagram and people had a problem with me saying eat eggs and meat. I mean,
why?
I don't know. Those are sources of sulfur and they're known to increase glutathione, sources of cysteine. So glutathione is made out of glutamate, cysteine, and glycine, 3 amino acids, extremely simple, but cysteine is the least abundant. So it's the rate limiting amino acid. The more cysteine you can feed your body, the more glutathione you can make. That's basically what it is. It's limited by the amount of cysteine that you consume.
And where cysteine is that an essential amino acid?
It is.
And is it, so where do we find that? In meat?
In meat, eggs, dairy products.
What are the other two? So cysteine, glycine,
and glutamate.
And glutamate. Glycine we also tend to underconsume because it's found in, I don't know if is glycine to be found in plants? I think it is actually, but it's 1/3 of collagen is glycine, and we tend to underconsume collagenous. We don't really consume much collagenous tissue these days.
Yeah, and then leafy vegetables, like you said, sulforaphane that can help provide the sulfur that you need, which is part of the cysteine, because basically it's the sulfur part of the glutathione that has all the power, and that's found in the cysteine molecule, in the cysteine amino acid.
Wow, so cruciferous vegetables, broccoli, the smelly vegetable. You can smell sulfur.
Yes, you can. And then also garlic, onions, asparagus, let me think, berries, green tea, so matcha specifically.
Matcha?
Yeah, can increase glutathione production. Whey protein, if you are someone that likes to consume that has been shown in human studies to increase glutathione production as well.
Whey protein?
Whey protein.
Wow.
By just providing the amino acids.
I'm a huge fan of whey protein.
Yeah.
Take it like 2 or 3 times a day.
but you need to find the right one.
That's probably an overstatement. Yeah, like once a day. Wait, what do you mean you need to find the right one?
Well, purity is absolutely imperative. If you're looking for protein powder, those are some of the most contaminated products on the market.
Protein powders.
Protein powders.
Protein powders are some of the most contaminated products on the market.
Yes.
Why? And contaminated with what?
Well, if you're getting plant-based proteins, then it's heavy metals. If you're getting chocolate plant-based proteins, then it's a double whammy because chocolate is a source of lead. It can be. So if you're buying protein powder off the shelf and it's a chocolate plant-based protein, I would urge you to take a pause and look at the contaminant report. If you can ask that brand if they've tested their products third party for contaminants, that's really important. If it's something you consume every day, if it's not something you're consuming every single day, then it doesn't have to be as pure.
So whey, and vanilla. Vanilla whey is probably your safest.
Vanilla whey, yeah, would be likely the least source of contaminants, the lowest.
Okay, but my vanilla whey has natural flavors. Are we cool with that?
Depends what's in there. You can ask the company. So if you see natural flavors, again, don't run for the hills and think that it's off the table. Do a little bit of legwork. If it's a brand that you love and you're using all the time, just ask the company what's in your flavor. And if they are hiding from the question, evading or not answering or ghosting, that's not a good sign. But at the same time, think of how frequently you're consuming it and what are the benefits. Are there more benefits than there are risks? To a protein powder, if there's more benefits than risks, then that's not necessarily a bad thing. And I think that's also a key component of low tox living and the mindset that I want more people to have is just looking at an overall benefit risk ratio. There's risks with everything. Get the product that has the most benefits and the least amount of risks. That's the key. Not perfect. There's no such thing as no tox. Low tox.
Low tox. I love that. So eat beef and eggs, cruciferous vegetables, exercise regularly, sweating as well, I would assume.
Oh, sweating is
independent of
exercise. Yes, correct. Independent of the things that we've mentioned. Sweating is a pathway for detoxification of heavy metals, bisphenol, phthalates, organophosphate chemicals, pesticides. So a lot of people will say, "Oh, well, sweating is not a detox pathway," but it actually is.
It is, yeah. I mean, that's pretty clear. There are studies, they're blood, urine, sweat studies.
Yes, I love those studies. Those are great because for the first time, they exactly identified what's coming out in the sweat. And before that, it was kind of just postulated that it's a detox pathway, it's healthy to sweat, but now there's actual hard evidence.
And what about, I mean, another route of detoxification is pooping, right? I mean,
absolutely. That's one of the major ones, pooping and urination. So if you're not actively pooping or regularly, then that's a problem because a lot of fat-soluble compounds get broken down by the liver and will be found in feces. So if it's still sitting in your colon for prolonged periods, they can, I guess, re-enter the circulation or...
And is this why dietary fiber plays a role in helping us detox? Because, I mean, my understanding is that it traps these bile acids that contain compounds that the liver has basically deemed for excretion, and the fiber essentially traps them.
Yeah, it helps to bind it and keep it trapped within the matrix of the feces. But urine is also massively important. And people don't drink enough water, they're not urinating enough, or, they have some issues with kidney, and there are some chemicals that can target kidney health as well. So if you're having, any kind of problems there, you should get that checked out. I mean, it's pretty simple to do. If you're going to a doctor, get your urinalysis.
Wow, so much incredible information, Dr. Burkart. This is a fascinating conversation and so important. And I feel like, I mean, we didn't even get to touch on GMOs, which a lot of people are curious about, have a lot of concerns about, rightfully so or not, I don't know. My understanding with GMOs is that there's only about 12 items that are typically genetically modified. And most of them aren't consumable anyway. Do you have any concerns about that?
I think the process of creating the GMO isn't the issue. I think it's the processing of the GMO crops.
Right, like why these crops are genetically modified. It's so they can withstand being doused by herbicides and pesticides.
Right.
It's not the GMO necessarily that's concern.
Right. That doesn't concern. I don't see that as a legitimate concern because there is evidence of potential gene transfer just in the environment. It's not an isolated event, that it was a man-made process. So I think it's the post-processing and how things are treated, how the crops are treated, and the products that they end up in. That's more of the problem, in my opinion.
Got it. Makes a ton of sense. Well, yeah, this was a great starting place. I'd love to, you're welcome back anytime. Would love to do a round two. I'm sure we're going to get a ton of questions as a result of this. You guys can go to our YouTube channel where this video is posted and drop some questions in the comment, or if you're watching this on YouTube, leave some questions down below and I'll be sure to get to as many as I can. And maybe you'll be so kind as to chime in as well. But I've got one last question for you before we get to that. Where can people find you on social media and support your work? Oh,
I'm on Instagram. You can find me at Dr. Yvonne Burkart. My website also has a ton of information and resources and free guides and downloads that I've created. That's DrYvonneBurkart.com. And I also have created an online course to help consumers be able to navigate ingredient lists in a way that is evidence-backed and using toxicological techniques and strategies in a practical way to navigate those ingredient lists that may look like a completely foreign language.
Well, I'm grateful that we have a black sheep such as yourself spreading the good word. And it's the black sheeps that end up changing the world for the better, typically. So yeah, I'm grateful for you. And I know that you probably get a lot of pushback, as do I, as does anybody who's really trying to change things today. And so thank you for doing what you do. The last question that gets asked everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
Living a genius life means using your genius superpower, which is your intuition, to help guide your decisions over fear.
Yes.
Believe it or not, intuition has a lot to do with avoiding toxic chemicals. A lot of it is innate, right? You smell something bad, okay, maybe that's not a good situation to be in. Our senses really give us a lot of information. So I think relying on how we feel on a gut level, is this something that makes me feel better, or am I more afraid? Am I more afraid? Then maybe don't go down that route.
Yeah, so true. Well, thanks again for coming out.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.